Everybody see what the Lord has done. Give me beautiful ashes, yeah.
Washington, D.C. On behalf of the African Leadership Magazine and Dr. Ken Giami, the publisher of the African Leadership Magazine, may I bid you good evening and welcome. My name is Aaron Menego, and I will be serving as your moderator and master of ceremony as such for this evening's discussion. The topic of discussion for this evening will be Africa, anti-corruption, and looking at plausible remedies to deal with that. I think we have a robust panel slated to take part in the discussion this evening, and we'll also be hearing from the Minister of Finance from Namibia, as well as a number of CEOs and executives from various countries in Africa. So with that, and also let me bring up Mr. Kingsley Okeke, the managing editor.
I'll just make a quick remark before the minister joins us this evening. Like Aaron said, you're welcome to this evening's roundtable. It's supposed to be a very closed and closely knit discussion this evening, and because we felt that, like we do in African Leadership Magazine, basically we like to contribute towards topical discourse in the continent and see how we can provide solutions to some of the problems we are encountering in the continent. And this evening, of course, the topic of discussion will be on anti-corruption, because we've seen that it's a major issue in the continent. Yes, it's a global issue, but Africa has a unique story, as it were, when it comes to corruption. And we've seen the impact and the effect of corruption on the youth, and especially women and children in the continent. So we felt that it was important that we make it a topic of discussion today, and see how we can rub minds together and find solutions of the way forward. So again, I will welcome you, and I welcome the Honorable Rep. Billy Mitchell from the Georgia House of Representatives, and unfortunately the Minister of Health. I welcome you all, especially our award recipients for this evening. The United States as the host of today's discussion, and the answer is very simple. Like I said earlier, corruption is a global issue, and much more importantly, we know that corruption issues, as it were, and the proceeds of corruption are not actually within the jurisdiction of our continent. Most often the destinations of illicit funds and all that are outside Africa. So we felt that it was important to look at the best practices, what other countries are doing, and how we can share from some of these best practices towards advancement. And quite frankly, this platform will enable us, of course, understand some of the issues and also see how we can together collaborate to provide solutions to some of these issues. The African Union recently estimated that the continent loses about 100 billion annually to corruption. This is like 2 times the size of the budget of some countries put together. While it is easy to identify the victims of corruption, especially women, and it's impossible to actually pinpoint how much we because of the paucity of data. We have a very poor record, method of comparison of this data. So this is just, which is alarming in itself. And we're saying that Transparency International said recently about corruption on the continent. It says that Sub-Saharan Africa is like the worst in terms of corruption perception index, and this is very very disturbing, and you can look at everything that how corruption affects everything that we do. It pulls back the will of progress, and it calls for urgent attention. Just like it was Reverend King that said that talked about the urgency of now. There is no better time than now for us to come together and see how we can tackle this issue headlong and see, and make no mistake, we are quite aware that there are some countries that are making progress, as it were, in terms of fighting corruption. Botswana is a classic example, and Rwanda is also a very good example, and Namibia, of course, ranking fourth on the Corruption Perception Index for 2018 is also a very good example. The current administration in Sierra Leone is trying to also make some effort towards that direction. In Nigeria, of course, we might have our own stories, our own biases, but we must also agree that they've made some considerable progress. And we can only but encourage them to do more. So that's why we're having this conversation today. And we believe that seated here in the room are those who can help make that happen. It's not actually in the number, but it's in the commitment of every one of us that sit here today that we are willing to do something in our little enclave. Because even in businesses, and transparency in business is also part of the story. So if we together, before we leave this place, make a commitment that we want to take or tackle this issue headlong, I believe we would have started somewhere. On behalf of African Leadership Magazine, of course, I will implore you to recommit yourself to joining the global call to save the continent. Africa dreams lies within reach, but only bold, brave, and deliberate planning can get us where we want to go. And once again, I thank you all for coming, and I wish you a very fruitful deliberation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kingsley, for those timely remarks to kind of frame our discussion for this evening. But part of the main thrust of our discussion tonight is to hear from the Honorable Minister Kale Schletwine, the Minister of Namibia. And if you have not, on your entrance this evening, picked up the latest copy of the African Leadership Magazine, he is featured prominently on the cover. So I'm sure we're all going to be very keen to hear his take not only on this subject of anti-corruption, but him providing a little scope and substance to Namibia in particular and its financial situation and direction, and then maybe providing a little color for our discussion with respect to finance and anti-corruption as it relates to the entire continent. I would take a moment to talk a little about our Right Honorable Minister, who is here with us this evening. Minister Schletwine is a Namibian politician who has served as the country's Minister of Finance since 2015 and previously served as Minister of Trade and Industry from 2012 to 2015. He served as Namibian independence. He served at Namibian independence in 1990 and has served as permanent secretary in various ministries. After 7 years of deployment in the Ministry of Finance, the President appointed Mr. Schletwine to the National Assembly as one of the 6 non-voting members of Parliament appointed by the President for the term that began in March of 2010. He was then appointed as Deputy Minister of Finance in 2010. In 2012, Minister Schlettwein was appointed Minister of Trade and Industry, where he became the first white senior cabinet member since the early post-independence years. Under President Jean Job, Mr. Schlettwein was moved to the post of Minister of Finance in March of 2015. So without further ado, can we bring Minister Schlettwein to the podium for remarks and comments with a round of applause.
Mr. Hawa Shafai, the CEO and founder of Training Excellence Africa and Middle East, Dr. Ken Yami, the publisher of African Leadership Magazine. I had hoped to meet my colleague here, Dr. Anthony Augustine. I understand he is either on his way or not yet coming anymore. Ending with you this important discussion that entails a topic that should occupy us 24/7. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the advisory board of the African Leadership Magazine for the kind invitation and the opportunity afforded to me to address this gathering of global prominence on this 7th December 2018, which is the United Nations declared Day of Anti-Corruption. Ladies and gentlemen, corruption is the evil that touches almost every aspect of the economy. It's one of the ugliest causes for inequality, as it becomes increasingly manifest proportionate with increasing economic opportunities and growing elitism. It retards progress towards shared prosperity, as it apportions wealth to the elite, illegally so, and by doing so, it perpetuates poverty of the majority. Corruption always has a corrupting and a corrupted party. It takes two to tango. It is the metaphoric dance with the rattlesnake, where initially the smooth movements are exceedingly pleasing and enticing, but the outcome is painful and may be lethal, because the snake bites in the end, and it always will. The specter of corruption has been haunting communities over the globe since immemorial times. It is indeed a global phenomenon, giving interconnectedness in the global economy and financial system. Corruptus, as the Latin connotative meaning reveals, is a form of disintegration, a state of decay, impairment of integrity, and systemic breakdown. In fact, it may be enshrined in our genetic makeup and individual relative prepositions. Richard Dawkins, in his lecture, The Value of Science and the Science of Values, postulates rather convincingly that, and I quote, "A large purpose of the doctrine of the selfish gene is to explain how selfishness at the gene level can lead to altruism at the level of the individual organism. But that covers altruism as a kind of selfishness in disguise. First, altruism towards kin, that's nepotism. And second, boons giving the mathematical expectations of reciprocity. You help me and I pay you later." I must, however, hasten to state that I in no way wish to posit that corruption is genetically anchored and can therefore not be eliminated. In fact, to the contrary, evidence of humankind's ability to rebel against its genetic makeup and behave differently is abundant. For example, the use of contraceptives which undermine the purpose of propagation is a case in point. Be that as it may, it is with us, and such state, if it were not rebelled against and deterred, will coalesce us into economic and social fabric of societies with a consequence of displacing some of these social scarce resources from their best use. The losses are significant and the impact on societies is brutal and often lethal. It is the most harmful to the poor. When discussing corruption, or better still the fight against corruption, we have to interrogate the value set by our societies. And sadly, in my own opinion, modern urban life has experienced a drastic shift and erosion of values. Values enhancing and cementing social cohesion and broad-based welfare are under pressure of being replaced by materialism and greed. To have lots of money is the ultimate, regardless of how that is achieved. The shift away from social fairness and equality to materialism and political selfishness has moved beyond the individual level and has become a populist political doctrine. This is often based on blind prejudice, racism, xenophobia, misogyny, and their likes, which reminds me, in fact, of the darkest era of apartheid and its excess in our subcontinent. Over the past 2 decades or so, the world has witnessed the rebirth of Africa, the revival of a resurgent Africa, that is, the African Renaissance. Africa is on the rising trajectory. This is a new Africa short storyline, anchored in its youthful population, growing consumer markets, and improved governance index and macroeconomic management. African economies such as Ethiopia, Cote d'Ivoire, Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, and Ghana are among the world's fastest growing economies. The other side of the coin is unfortunately still evident, with some African countries featuring as the most corrupt on International Transparency's Index on Perceived Corruption. State capture and systemic corruption are still topical issues on the continent. In the meantime, Africa has launched an all-out war on poverty. For Namibia and South Africa, where inequalities are stark, the erosion of inequalities is an integral part of the war on poverty, and this is being pursued through inclusive economic growth and empowerment objectives. Corruption is directly countering these objectives. The African Union Convention on Prevention and Combating of Corruption calls on all African states and institutions to prevent, detect, punish, and eradicate corruption and related offences in the public and private sectors. At the same time, the AU Agenda 2063, which sets out the continent's strategic transformation path over the next 45 years, aspires for a transformative leadership across the continent with strong emphasis on the needed political will to translate these commitments into visible actions. Namibia was born out of a political regime of apartheid, a system of state-sanctioned subjugation of black people. This was a brutal system where racism and oppression of people of color was legitimized. Apartheid also left a legacy of corruption. Resources and economic opportunities were reserved for the white elite, and the state machinery was deployed to protect and perpetuate exclusivity, not inclusivity. After liberating ourselves from this detested political and economic pillage, we unfortunately are again witnessing corruption increasingly rearing its ugly head as economic opportunities arise and elitism grows. Persistently, high inequalities are fertile ground for growing elitism and entitlement attitudes of these elites. It is further fueled by political campaigns that were kept largely under the surface, but are now bringing into the open murky emotions that were defeated by social justice, solidarity, human dignity, and environmental sustainability. One of the immediate consequences may be more corruption, not less. Notably, and in reaction to the above, the all-out war on poverty and inequality is the cornerstone in our economic restructuring agenda. Shared prosperity and inclusive economic growth must be aggressively advanced. At the same time, the opportunities created, demand for capital accumulation and entrepreneurship, if left unwatched, all create festive grounds for graft and corruption to fester. In effect, the economic and social costs of corruption become manifest from the significant opportunities foregone, weakening state institutional capacity and public trust, all of which adversely impact on the state capacity to foster a conducive environment of economic growth and reduction of poverty. This economic growth-corruption nexus is particularly concerning. The haves proceed to induce in emerging vulnerable middle class and entrepreneurs into the realm of corruption. This is manifested through increasing phenomenon of fronting, abuse of public office and resources, as well as increased illicit financial flows. The revealing evidence brought forth by the African Union's report, authored by His Excellency Thabo Mbeki, the former President of the Republic of South Africa, on illicit financial flows amounted to approximately $50 billion per year from the continent, indicates the extent of which private sector transactions are not immune to lack of integrity. It is in fact the private sector transactions which are the enduring channel for transmission of the corruption rollercoaster. Natural resources economies in Africa have particularly been prime focus of illicit financing flows. Misinvoicing and transfer pricing, and Namibia is no exception. A case of under-declaration of imports through customs operation and the collusion of clearing agents at the port of Walvis Bay has been now before the court, involving potential illicit outflows of several millions of Namibian dollars. If anything, the recent Panama Papers have, amongst others, further revealed how oblique corporate channels are used to conceal the proceeds of illicit behavior, tax evasion and corruption. The Panama Papers is yet a prime example of increasing plethora of briefcase companies in tax haven jurisdictions into which profits are shifted. Some of the Namibian-based fishing and mining entities have not escaped being named and shamed in this infamous case. Ladies and gentlemen, rampant corruption is a matter of choice. To diminish and deter the rise of corruption, each country has the choice to define its tolerance stance and enforce it within the confines of its laws and checks and balances. Combating corruption encompasses a blend of measures across the mutual reinforcing dimensions of good governance, transparency, accountability, and the strength of public institutions. African leaders have, therefore, diverse opportunities across these dimensions to diminish and deter corruption. First, anti-corruption measures must be embedded in national laws and institutions. Second, having laws and legal provisions to deal with corruption is only a necessary condition. These provisions must be enforced from investigation stage to prosecution once alleged corruption has been proven. The legal framework be afforded unfettered independence and sufficient teeth to bite. Anti-corruption watchdogs should be allowed free and objective reign to expose and investigate instances of alleged corruption without fear, favor, or interference. Media freedom and a free press are an absolute necessary ancillary public good in this process. Third, we should incubate strong and effective institutions with capacity to execute their mandates objectively, effectively, and in reasonable time spans. Absent this potential of law and institutional capacity, public trust begins to erode. Fourthly, the theory of crime argues for strong interdependence between detection of alleged crime and the penalties associated with actual occurrence. Presumably, penalties should be sufficient high to serve as a deterrent for potential future occurrences. Unfortunately, however, with the exorbitant rewards of corruption, it does not always hold. A wide net of preventative, investigative, and alternative punitive measures must therefore be available. Lastly, transparency and accountability are the anchor of public trust. This ethos necessitates compulsory disclosure provisions from all politicians and of political trust, both from politicians and officials. So, Master of Ceremonies, Namibia has pronounced its corruption-tolerant stance and proceeded to take visible action in the extent of this stance. His Excellency President Hage Geingob has declared zero tolerance to corruption in all its facets. The head of state, that is President Geingob, has proceeded to lead the way by declaring his assets publicly. So did the First Lady. The Minister of Finance, that's myself, followed suit. Members of Parliament were obliged to equally step up and submit their assets. Apart from institutionalizing the Anti-Corruption Commission, we have gone as far as effecting constitutional amendments so that corruption-busting measures are embedded on a solid policy framework. We have instituted a whistleblowers protection legislation and witness protection legislation, which have been brought into force. In public finance and the financial sector, we have instituted measures to ensure that unsolicited bids do not find room and hold sway. In particular, a rule-based public-private partnership legal and institutional framework is established, with equal measures of operational independence and demand for unsolicited bids being nipped in the bud. Specific instances of reported corruption, bribery and other improperly and circumvent state procedure are promptly reported for the law to take its course. Years back, when we had to procure a set of scanner equipment for customs services, instances of alleged bribery and kickbacks were noticed and dealt with immediately through courts, resulting into asset freezes and forfeitures. A high-profile case of money swindling from the Social Security Commissioner of Namibia, which came to be known as scandal, was dealt with through legal channels, resulting in imprisonment and financial penalties for perpetrators. A robust anti-money laundering regime is in place to deter, combat and eliminate anti-money laundering and financing of terrorism activities. Other legal instruments in force include the Prevention of Organized Crime Act and the Anti-Corruption Act. All have helped to strengthen the legal and regulatory framework to prevent and combat corruption. The implementation of the AML regime has resulted in asset freezes and forfeitures of perpetrators and these deeds. The progress we have made to keep the manifestations of corruption in check have contributed to the maintenance of peace and stability and quality of institutions. Namibia is ranked as the 5th corruption-free country on the African continent and the 53rd out of the 175 countries globally rated. We rank 2nd with the freest press in Africa, based on the analysis of Reporters Without Borders. The Governance Index places us number 4, after Mauritius, Seychelles, and Cape Verde. What obtains from this cluster of evidence is that while the scale appears not to be pervasive, we are not immune from corruption, nor are we corruption-free. We have made commendable advances on this front, and I can cite some material cases. The Windhoek International Airport contract, which was unprocedurally awarded with significant cost escalations from an original price estimate of 3.5 billion to 7 billion, was stopped, and this principled action was upheld by the judiciary. This indicates the extent to which conflict of interest due to potential abuse of public office can be extremely costly to state coffers. Almost double the price for the same product. The suspected corruption case involving customs and excise officials and clearing agents I described earlier is put before the court for investigation and alleged mass invoicing. The value of trade of this corruption case is about $3.5 billion. Asset freezes has been meted, for instance, of suspected corruption involving both public and private sector officials and suspected tenderpreneurs. Investigation on the drivers of cost escalation of large capital projects, like an oil storage facility at the port of Walvis Bay, are being undertaken with consequences on suspected public offices. It can be fairly concluded, therefore, that we have witnessed discernible progress on the policy measures, overall governance and institutional capacity. However, a contradiction in term arises in the process of economic transformation and social changes, as the majority are mainstreamed into economic activity. Inclusiveness and increasing economic opportunity awaken a class of elites who deem the increasing opportunities as their time and turn to eat, thus aggravating and perpetuating of this evil and its associated economic costs. Leaders like ourselves and the institutions we represent have the opportunity to implement a manifold of rule-based measures for effective checks and balances and to deter and eliminate the scourge of corruption. In the spirit of sustainable development and partnerships, the assemblage of role players and expertise are here and now. Africa and the world leaders across the globe can seize this opportunity to champion this crusade for a fair and just global community. Chairman, allow me to end my presentation with a quote from Mahatma Gandhi, and I quote, "I will not let anyone walk through my mind with their dirty feet." End of quote. We leaders must be clean. We must lead by example. Only then will we win back the trust of the people. The biggest award is when an ordinary person approaches you and says, I appreciate what you are doing, please don't give up. I thank you for...
When you leave the podium, Minister, we have a presentation from the state of Georgia that we would like to make for you. We would ask for a representative presentation.
Mr. Schlettwein, I will tell you this, reading your background, the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus, we consist of 61 members. We're the largest such caucus in the United States, as a matter of fact. And before I begin, I will tell you, my grandmother used to tell me growing up that you are judged by the company you keep. I sure wish she was alive to see this today. She would think I grew up to be somebody here with this great company here. But Minister Schlettwein, let me just read to you what will be permanently enshrined in the law books of Georgia. I have your address. I'm going to make sure that you receive a copy of that. And as a resolution, it simply states that whereas the Honorable Carl Herman Gustav Schlettwein is a Namibian politician who has served his country as Minister of Finance since 2015, beginning with the independence in 1990, where he served as permanent secretary in various ministries. And whereas under then President Minister Schlettwein was moved to the post of Minister of Finance in 2015, be it therefore resolved that the Legislative Black Caucus of the Georgia General Assembly and the members of this august body salute the accomplishments of Minister Honorable Carl Herman Gustav Schlettwein. If you would help me. I represent an area called Stone Mountain, Georgia, the same Stone Mountain where Martin Luther King Jr. said in his famous I Have a Dream speech, let freedom ring, even from Stone Mountain, Georgia. And your cause here to eliminate corruption is one that we take very seriously. I would hope that once you come up with your resolutions, your resolves, you'll pass them on to us because we have some issues ourselves.
I'm humbled. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We have one more, Minister. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Great presentation.
Now the principles are not bad, but what is not very helpful is that it is prone by unilateralism. And Africa, who is the partner in that agreement, has actually no or very little say of who is eligible, what the criteria for eligibility are, what the commodities are that can be used, and so on. We hope that the future relationship would be a better partnership that is grounded in democracy and equal partnership instead of unilateralism and a de facto master and subject relationship. We, of course, realize that the United States is the largest market. Africa has a lot to offer for it, and we are also aware that we can and should make use of the huge amount of technology, of skills that are available in the United States. We believe, therefore, that a true partnership would be the model that best yields, that best makes use of all our capacities and not an one-sided action that we have experienced so far.
So, ladies and gentlemen, let's once again give Finance Minister Schlettwein a round of applause. Ladies and gentlemen, so moving along with our agenda, we're going to take a very, very brief intermission, you can please help yourself to food. We'll reconvene to move into the next portion, which will be our panel portion, where we have some of our CEOs from various jurisdictions, various countries in Africa, and they will lend their ideas and ideals in the area of anti-corruption as it relates to the corporate sector. And come right back in 5 minutes or so. So thank you, and again, thank you.
A round of applause, please.
Yes,
for
it
Honorable
really
Minister. Rep. Billy Mitchell is still going to make one more presentation because he's going to be catching his flight back to Atlanta. So let me welcome the representative of Honorable Sekonte Davis to come up on stage and receive a honorary citizenship on his behalf. Please follow.
I get to do all the good things. You know, there is no better honor you can have than to be declared an honorary Georgian citizen. You know, the highest award that we give to a civilian in our state is called the Honorary Georgian Citizen. I will tell you, we've given this award to the likes of Oprah Winfrey, Muhammad Ali, and so many others. I have to convince our colleagues that the person is worthy, and it is regulated by the Secretary of State. Some of you may be aware our Secretary of State ran for governor, and through some manipulation, some will say, won that race. But he was replaced by a black woman. He resigned about 2 weeks ago and was replaced by a black woman. The first such black person to ever serve as Secretary of State in the state of Georgia. And I want to let you know that you are the first person to receive an honorary Georgian by that black woman as Secretary of State. So please help me welcome the new honorary Georgian citizen, Ms. Davis.
Please, thank you. Remarks.
Yes.
Love some remarks.
Wow. I'm actually overwhelmed. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I really thank you so much for everything. I'm actually here to represent Dr. Sekonte Davis and operation in Nigeria and Nigerian Post Authority. So I really appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. Even if he's not here, he's really thankful. He's also sent his love, appreciation. He's actually humble, and he said I should tell you thank you. I want to thank the board of directors of African Leadership Magazine. Thank you so much. We do appreciate it. I also want to thank the rep too. Thank you. I do appreciate it. Thanks.
The only thing I'm missing is invitation to go to Nigeria and Libya.
All right.
You're welcome.
I'm sure we're going to arrange that. Let me just hand over to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kings. So, Minister Schleckwein, I know you didn't think we would let you get off that easy after gracing us with such great comments. Clearly, Namibia, through your office and the leadership of President Yanga, is taking anti-corruption seriously. And as you mentioned, you are clearly leading by example. The question that we have is, have you been working with your other colleagues, ministers of finance respectively, from other countries throughout Africa to put forward some best practice measures that the others would consider following and adopting as best practice measures to improve these flows of anti-corruption throughout the continent? Could you comment on that, please, sir?
Yes, thank you very much, and I wholeheartedly agree with you that alone one cannot win the battle. We have to do it collectively and together. There are a number of matters that we have managed to do together, and the most important one is the AU, the African Union Protocol on anti-corruption and the combat of corruption. It is a protocol that has received consensus from all ministers of finance, and in fact the assembly itself. Presidents have underwritten it. We are in the process now of urging member states to ratify that protocol so that it comes in force, and the first ratifications have been achieved.
How is that being received through the other finance ministers, the other presidents? Is this something that there's been some degree of pushback on, or is this something that's been readily embraced?
No, it was embraced completely, hence a consensus that was quickly reached. But in all, you know, I don't think we can be euphoric about it when we have a piece of paper that is ratified. We must see how it is implemented and to what extent the political will then carries that piece of continental legislation. And it's early days. But I think it is a first step, and we should not shoot down what is a good initiative that is starting to unroll. If one looks at the African continent, governance and democracy and democratic principles, human rights, free press, elections are vastly improving. The days of coups are over, and the AU has now a very strong determination to not accept any country that has not elected its leaders democratically. So we are moving, and we are together with political and governance issues, of course, must move on financial issues. You asked me what other tangible issues we are. We have an African Tax Forum through which we exchange tax information so that we know where is the illicit money actually landing. One thing is to determine where it is coming from, but for us the more important one is where is it landing, so that we can approach those that have the benefits of it to return it to where it belongs. So an African Tax Forum, important forum where this information change is happening. We have, as African countries, also cooperation with and through the OECD, where we adopt best practices and bring them back into our own tax systems. Now, the ultimate reason is, yes, the fight of corruption. But what is also underlying that effort is that Africa must enable itself to fund its own agenda. We cannot sit and say, you Europeans or Americans or Chinese must fund our development agenda. We cannot say that. We must be able to do that ourselves. And one source of funding is to curb illicit outflows. Illicit outflows are larger than any foreign aid that the African continent has ever received. So the potential to be self-funding, the potential to be free from the master that through funding dictates what you want to do, is actually the most important aspect that we are chasing. And that hopefully will happen soon. The AU has created a committee of 15 ministers of finance of which Namibia is one member.
I would hope you'd be leading that effort.
Our main task is within the reform agenda of the African Union to bring about self-sufficiency, not only for development programs of the AU, but also the peacekeeping. And we have, for the first time this year, reached a level of just over 60%. It was much lower before. And we are therefore looking with confidence in the future that the African continent is enabling itself through a number of initiatives that's on the political side, the democratic side, the good governance side, but then materially on the financial side as well.
Final question, Minister Sletwine. I've read many articles and heard discussion that as part of this One Africa concept, that Africa wants to move from an extraction to a transactions-based economy. How do the finance ministers see Africa moving from an extraction to a transactions-based economy as a way of creating a taxable companies that come in to extract minerals and other valuables in the continent?
I think you touched the area where we believe a great potential can unfold, and that is in the CFTCA, that's the continent-wide free trade arrangement. We believe that through a enhanced intra-Africa trade, we can bring about that transactional advancement away from a primary sector dependent economy. Primary sector dependent economy are those economies that poorly depend on resources, whether it's oil or minerals or agricultural produce, raw materials. And that is very characteristic for many African economies. We are sellers, we trade in minerals and oil. The sad part is we are price takers. We don't determine the price. And therefore, at the bottom of the value chain, intra-Africa trade through a continent-wide free trade arrangement would allow us to add value to these raw materials, convert them, transform them into either transitionals or finished commodities with ourselves with it. And that will make us moving away from being a price taker. We can then determine price.
Is that going into doing physical arbitrage right there within the countries, particularly platinum, things of that nature?
Well, I can use an example of Namibia. We have in Namibia been diamond mining for about 120 years. And what we did up to now was selling rough. In fact, our legal framework was crafted to protect those that import or that export rough, the mining companies, foreign entities. We've changed that legal provision to force now those entities to sell rough diamonds into the Namibian economy so that they can be value added. And we have established a number of polishing, cutting entities as a first step. The next step that we are now developing is to complete the value chain and engage in jewel making. Our diamonds are not industrial diamonds, they are jewel diamonds, and Namibia is lucky. We have some gold, we have some silver, we have no platinum, and we have diamonds, and we have a whole range of other precious stones like tourmalines, amethyst, and the jewel making value chain offers itself to do exactly what you have said. Yes, therefore it is up and coming. course, capacity building to get the necessary skills, to find the necessary markets are important. And again, as Namibia, we have combined all these by getting good market access within Africa. We have de facto free access into the whole of Southern Africa through the SADC Free Trade Protocol. We have now agreed and signed the tripartite free trade agreement between SADC, that's Southern Africa, COMESA, that's part of East Africa, and the East African Community. So we have a free trade arrangement within almost half of Africa. And then, of course, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which we also have signed, will accomplish the rest. We do the same with food and beverages. We have a good beef and mutton industry. We sell almost all our production into Africa. Namibia is after South Africa, the second largest intra-Africa trader. So we are not by far close to South Africa, but proportionately we are the second largest trader within Africa. So the promise is matched by what we are actually doing. Our efforts are to trade within Africa. Our efforts are to create value chains, to bring us up the value chain on both legs of the U, and it is happening slowly, sometimes too slow, but let's keep on trying.
Well, leave you with this, Minister Schledwine. You're here at the historic National Press Club, making remarks with respect to Namibia and anti-corruption in Africa. Some of the world's thought leaders come through and make similar remarks. Next week, U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton is reveal the United States' new policy towards Africa. If you could influence what would be in his statements from an economic and finance standpoint, what would you suggest to Ambassador, National Security Advisor Bolton and President Trump as far as taking a economic and finance new approach towards Africa?
The approach that we have learned to use and to operate in is the AGOA arrangement. It's a preferential arrangement that the United States offered Africa to access its market. Now the principles are not bad, but what is not very helpful is that it is prone by unilateralism. And Africa, who is the partner in that agreement, has actually no or very little say of who is eligible, what the criteria for eligibility are, what the commodities are that can be used, and so on. We hope that the future relationship would be a better partnership that is grounded in democracy and equal partnership instead of unilateralism and a de facto master and subject relationship. We, of course, realize that the United States is the largest market. Africa has a lot to offer for it, and we are also aware that we can and should make use of the huge amount of technology, of skills that are available in the United States. We believe, therefore, that a true partnership would be the model that best yields, that best makes use of all our capacities and not an one-sided action that we have experienced so far.
So, ladies and gentlemen, let's once again give Finance Minister Schleppwein a round of applause. Ladies and gentlemen, so moving along with our agenda, we're going to take a very, very brief intermission. You can please help yourself to food. We'll reconvene to move into the next portion, which will be our panel portion, where we have some of our CEOs from various jurisdictions, various countries in Africa, and they will lend their ideas and ideals in the area of anti-corruption as it relates to the corporate sector. I'd like to take a moment and ask our panelists to just take a moment and just give a brief description and background on themselves before we get into the official Q&A portions of the evening. Oliver, we'll start with you.
Good evening.
No.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Reverend Zachary Oliver, and I wear a couple of hats. I do have one nonprofit called Bridging the Gap, which is dealing with development of future black leadership for world peace and social change. I work with the Washington Times Foundation, and we do philanthropic and other programs. I have a for-profit organization called American Development for Africa, and I'll tell you what that really means. And also I work at UPF, Universal Peace Federation, and in many ways I work with Aaron. So I wear a few hats. I'm very happy to be here to discuss anti-corruption in Africa. I believe Africa is poised for great things for the future. And the only way that Africa can really stand on the platform that is called for, because I have a reverend's hat, and I can say what God is calling us for, Africa for, is that Africa has to change certain things in order to really claim its final anointing. I would like just to bring into the mind set here for a minute, Africa, as we were listening to Mr. Renego and the other speakers. I think that one of the things that Africa, I feel, when you talk about democracy, America is probably one of the most developed democracy in human history, but it has a history, it has an origin, it has a root, and the root happens to have been its worldview. And its worldview was a Christian worldview, a religious worldview. And although I am African American, my roots are from Africa, we do have a spiritual root naturally from the continent. So how do we, and I'll just throw this out, as in order to become economically viable, not for the sake of the world, but for the sake of Africa's growth and development, where is our collective worldview? That, I believe, will determine a paradigm shift for Africa as a continent. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Mark Marvey. I'm a Liberian lawyer, and I have a background from civil society, many years of democracy and human rights promotion. I have fought for the rights of communities, especially forest communities, defending their rights to benefit from natural resources within the purview of their communities, and have also represented the rights of minority groups. I'm currently involved with commercial law practice and have a background in investment law. And so my view about the fight against corruption in Africa is wrapped in a legal framework of how Africa engages with the different regimes that it has to navigate globally, beginning with the Global Framework for Governance, the UN, and then to specific institutions that border on trade, like the WTO and the AU and other regional bodies. I think that the contracts and the different procedures for ratification, negotiation, award in Africa has significant implication for addressing corruption and also dealing with the question of development on the continent as well as economic empowerment. I believe that the way the contracts for investments, for example, has been structured have not necessarily been at arm's length, and as a result, Africa has been more or less at the receiving end. And I have reflected some of these views in my new book, which is titled All Nations Are Equal, at least on paper. In this book, I have tried to unveil the different circumstances under which investment in Liberia has resulted into more or less exploitation, and that Liberians and Liberia could benefit more if there were appropriate regulatory regimes, adequate human capacity and institutions, as well as proper procedures for the award, ratification, regulation of investments in the country. I believe that the structure of our contracts set the basis as to what we can benefit. If you look at the terms of our contracts, for example, just the aspect of dispute resolution. Normally you have clauses that will be indicating that the terms of the contract are governed by foreign laws where the investments are in Africa. You also will have terms such as the venue for resolution will be London, New York, DC, and all of those imposes difficulty on the companies that are engaging with international or multilateral corporations from foreign countries. Not only that, there are clear disadvantages in terms of the interpretations of law and the obligations to access adequate legal representation in those jurisdictions. That's just one aspect. But to close this introduction, I would say that there's so much hope for Africa because Africa has awakened to the new call and is recognizing that it has what it takes to be developed, to be prosperous, so that our young people cannot be running away, even at the risk of death, to seek greener pasture in other parts of the world. Thank you.
Right, okay, so good evening all. My name is Mark Atasie. So there are two Marks, the Liberian Mark and the Nigerian Mark, but I am Macaulay Atasie. I'm a Nigerian, as I've said. I'm the CEO of a strategy firm called Nexon. Nexon taking our businesses to the next level. That's what we focus on. This company, first, by the way, I have a master's in pharmacy. So I did not read economics or business, but I have done over 20 years of strategic consulting, having trained in Accenture and so on. Now, my company and I have worked for over half of the Nigerian banks, half of the regulators in Nigeria. We've worked for General Electric, World Bank, World Health Organization, several very well-heeled organizations that play in Nigeria. We've also worked outside Nigeria in over 23 African countries, supporting Nigerian entities that have gone beyond Nigeria. In the mid-2000s, I was very central, working in my company, to the export of Nigerian banking, or Nigerian banks, to various African countries. The first time we went to Ghana, we met the president of Ghana, and after speaking, he said Nigerian banks have come. I think he gave us a license. That bank is still very strong in Ghana today and has gone to many other parts of Africa. I worked in the mid-2000s, set up the first for-profit business incubator in Nigeria. For-profit, typically it's something you do as a non-profit organization, but I set up the first one supported by the World Bank. And that company, that incubator, helped set up over 23 companies. Some of them are doing fairly well today. I'm the president of the E-Payments Provider Association of Nigeria, which I believe is grooming a lot of things that are changing the way payments is done in Africa. In fact, in some instances, we are fairly ahead of the Western world when it comes to payments, because we came after, they have their stable cards and every other thing, but we had to run a mobile. And so some of the new mobile things happening here now, we started enjoying, in Nigeria, in the late 2000s and early 2010s and all that. So that's who I am. I'm a strategy consultant that's helping to create tomorrow, interpret their dreams, bring it down on paper, and then they're able to attract funding, attract business partners, and they're able to then get things done. Now, so my perspective, I'm not here primarily because of anti-corruption. I was supposed to be in Switzerland, but the invitation came late, so I couldn't go. But I think the organizer said I should come here to get this award, and so I'm involved in the discussion on corruption. My take, and it's interesting, I arrived at this conclusion as I thought through my usual submission to the world, which is about the economy. And about remember, innovation is strategy, really. You can't plan about yesterday. So you're planning about tomorrow. You are doing something great tomorrow. If not, nobody will buy it. Every country that had done well gave something to the world that they never had. You talked about Christianity that America put in front. You talk about some other organization. You have your solid minerals that you believe can be the lead. There will be something you are giving to the world. If you are giving nothing that people want to pay for, you will not make that developmental stride that you expect. But if your leadership structure does not protect the businesses and the citizens from corruption, you can't make significant progress. Because it's like a tap. As people work very hard to sell, the conditions around them make it difficult. So the exchange rate will be impossible because the financial structure, the central bank, is supporting the corrupt elite. And so the cost of doing business will be weak. You really can't export, or you can't buy great things to use to make the right kind of things. So my take, therefore, is the value of anti-corruption can be equated to patriotism. If you're a patriot, if you believe in your country, you will not want to drag the country down, because corruption reduces your productivity. And you're more productive as a nation to be a first world or a successful society. So that's my submission that I believe ties what I do to the anti-corruption crusade.
Thank you. And that is a great segue into the heart of the first question that we have for the panel. In 2014, President Barack Obama, then President, the former President Barack Obama, convened here in Washington, D.C., African presidents to come here to Washington to have discussions about U.S.-Africa relations in a broad, synthesize that down into meaningful policy that will be impactful both on the continent and here in the United States. On the heels of this meeting, the firm that I'm with was contracted out to look at and examine what were the push-pull factors that U.S. investment companies from Wall Street saw as impediments to foreign direct investment, both incoming and outgoing, but the African continent. I'll tell you a little bit of what we found in that study. One of the questions that was presented to the Wall Street executives was this: what do you see as the greatest challenge for Africa to attract global business investment? And we had several questions, answers that they could choose from war and violence as an impediment, lack of cultural understanding, language as a barrier, even disease. None of those things that you would think are the things that would impede U.S. businesses and Wall Street investors from looking at Africa as a viable market were at the top of the list. 55.56% of the 600 or so respondents to the study said unequivocally, improving transparency, business ethics, and good governance was the greatest challenge to global business attraction from Wall Street to Africa. Macaulay, you finished your comments sharing this same sentiment as these prominent Wall Street private equity firms, hedge funds, and others. How do you dovetail off of your comments to look at what Wall Street is saying in contrast or in similarity to the comments you just offered?
Thank you very much. Okay, so there are global standards for good governance, which reflect a standard way of doing things, and the next person believes that you are operating transparently. Now, the good thing is to give me comfort to put my money in somebody's hands. Remember, I'm not going to be running that business, and I'm sitting somewhere in New York, and I want to be part of a business to make cement, for instance, in Nigeria or in another part of Africa. I want to be comfortable that the business will be run to the best systems that I expected. The distinction between a particular level in either the government or the state or the country or businesses, as it were. So the reality is, if one country is able to reflect that their own environment represents good governance, most likely they will attract investment, because you need funding to do the things you need to do. And anybody who wants to put in money as either foreign direct investment, foreign portfolio investment or any other type of investment wants to be comfortable that that investment will be treated with the same level of rigor, same level of control that he's used to in his own country. So from an investment point of view, the lack of good governance in some African businesses and countries, I think hurts our ability to grow our economies, because you need foreign investments to build real big businesses. So, so I think basically it reinforces, but looking at Nigeria, I think we also have, I'm using Nigeria because that's where I operate, we've had a lot of codes in corporate governance that allow businesses to run in a certain minimum manner. The man that just walked in is the, I think that's the MD of the National Competitiveness Council in Nigeria, funded internationally. I think we also do reviews of all the states in our country periodically, where we determine which of the states are transparent enough, are less corrupt, do the right things that will give comfort to investors and businesses to operate in their economy. As we know, we haven't, as a nation, ranked very well, but there are efforts, you know, like measuring how well we are doing as a nation and as particular entities. So there are efforts at the business levels, there are efforts at national level and at state levels to see how we can run after this high level of transparency and ethics in the way we do things. We appreciate the benefit of such in doing the right things, because if you don't, the costs of doing your business will be above the roof. Nobody can predict how the business will be run. You know, because I give you money, you can use to do something else, you know, and so on. So we are fully aligned as a nation to pursuing the best levels of transparency.
Let me go to Mark. There's a saying here, at least in the U.S., that capital is a coward, and where there are not rules and measures and policy and law in place, finance goes the other way. Economic activity goes the other way. The ability for finance and trade to take place goes the other way. As a lawyer, let me go back to something. The Minister of Finance from Namibia gave some great points that Namibia is number 5 in Africa as far as anti-corruption, 53rd in the world. That's because good policy, good law, good leadership is in place to make sure that these things happen. So from a legal framework, how do you look to deal with corruption, and how do lawyers and the law come into play, particularly for corporations, corporate law?
Thank you. The greatest prerequisite for most investments across the world and investors will be the predictability of a judicial system or the ability of a country to uphold the rule of law. It is the rule of law in which all of these procedures are couched. For example, when you want to talk about the transparency frameworks, business ethics, governance, they are all based on the law. But without belaboring the point that the Minister of Namibia made, the Minister of Finance from Namibia made, as regards how they translate from being on paper to enforcement, it's a crucial point that rests within the question of governance and how our courts operate and our governance system and procedures, the extent to which they are open or transparent, the way they are accountable, as well as how the laws are enforced are key prerequisites of attracting and maintaining investments. If investors know that their investments will not be at risk because the rule of law is prevailing in a particular setting, they are more likely to put their resources in that place. Then, if they have doubts about the justice system, so where the costs are predictable, for example, the resolution or procedures and the time it takes to resolve commercial disputes, the costs, if those mechanisms allow for timely resolution of disputes and with minimum costs or burden to investors, they're more likely to put their resources at risk in such an environment. Howbeit, we are aware that our court systems and our governance arrangements are not free of corruption. And in some instances, yes, cases don't get heard on time. Even if they are heard, there's a whole lot of time that will elapse before a ruling can come. And so, in showing that, especially investment or commercial related transaction cases are determined timely, and that rulings in those disputes can be delivered timely, also enhances the environment for investment.
Corporations generally look for remedies for injury, real or perceived, and whether it's through arbitration or going through the full court process, or something that they look for. Have you found that to be the case?
Well, it depends, because if ADR, alternative dispute resolution, turns out to be less costly, corporations are more likely to consider that, as opposed to if there's an effective court system or an ineffective court system. And the option to engage in ADR is often as a result of fear of the burden that the court system is going to impose on the corporation and its resources. So if corporate leaders or shareholders know that they can go to court and they can get timely attention and determination of their matter, it can be disposed of with lower costs and investment can be secure, they're more likely to consider the court. However, because of the cumbersomeness of the court system, often procedures are long, they sometimes are not very transparent, and they're subject to influence from political actors, influential individuals in society, and sometimes personal interest clashes with the public good. Corporations and business people will assess the risk and will often take the less risky avenue of resolving the dispute.
So risk, remedy, resolution are the 3 R's that you think they would look for.
Definitely.
So a country
And
that
costs.
has more advanced dispute resolution practices are the type of countries that would more than likely receive a greater share of foreign direct investment and business enterprise coming in.
Correct.
Reverend Oliver, you mentioned about the after looking forward and being a great future and certainly present avenue for investment, engagement from an economic standpoint. The World Bank, in many instances, seems to think so as well. Just last year, the World Bank concluded a study that our firm just happened to put together for the World Bank. When we looked at over 1,000 mid-size corporations, and by mid-size corporations, by their standards, they were referring to companies that are between 500 million and 1 billion US. That's what they were considering mid-size corporations. Wall Street and private equity firms again. And the question that was posed to them was, what region of the world do you find most attractive for future business development opportunity? Over 70% of the respondents said Africa. To your point, why do you think they see Africa as a viable current and future investment option? And we're talking about mid-sized corporations, 500 million to $1 billion. Why would they find that attractive?
Well, number one, Africa has been poised as the economic frontier, global economic frontier in this century. The word frontier has not been used since the birth of America. And so to me, that's symbolic and has a symbolism to it. That's why I brought up the worldview. Secondly, to address what Mr. Monego had just said, if you look at the demographics of Africa are attractive. You have more millenniums there. You have the internet there. You are beginning to, what the world is beginning to see is not only the gold there and the minerals there, but they're beginning to see the other brilliant resources that might be there as well that translates into profit. Millenniums, they're on the internet. So it's attractive. There's so many things out there. So in order to attract them, to get them, to stabilize them, what concerted efforts are we making to remedy these issues that the gentleman on my right has stated in legal battles? Legal battles in itself, he is saying, are infiltrated with a little corruption because it's who you know. You prolong things and nobody wants to do that. But what are those things? So what I'm saying is what is it that we need to do to remedy that? That's why I use the word worldview. Worldview determines the direction you go to. People don't realize America is the biggest capitalist nation in the world. Capitalism started off as a Christian worldview. It has some morals, it has some ethics, it had some foundation, it had some roots, it had everything that became the guiding principle. Then you look at Korea. After the Korean War, South Korea was poorer than sub-Saharan Africa. Now it's running neck and neck with America and Japan. Why? They invested in infrastructure, health, and education. The government did it. Right? So when we look at someone, I think Mr. Monego or someone mentioned that giving, a nation that gives really is a nation that prospers. So as a continent, if we look on a personal level, not as a legal a person or a minister, we're looking at the suffering of a people that you look at every day. You see, that cannot become the catalyst for us to do something different. And the only way that can become a catalyst to do something different is that we have, as a continent, we have to come to some sort of resolve of what kind of standards and principles that we need to infiltrate within our constitutions, within our legal systems, within how we run our governments. So, as he said, once we get those into place, and then I just want to address real quick that I was very pleased with President Obama when he invited all the presidents of Africa. Finally, America took its responsibility. America is in debt to Africa. In debt to Africa. Africa's already paid its dues to America through its children called the African Americans. See? So then Africa, I feel that America historically have a fiduciary responsibility eventually to assist, not take over, but assist Africa in its growth and development. It has its problem, but one thing that can guide, that keeps America a little in step, is that it does have certain ethics and morals and principles that are intricate in the justice system, that you can get some resolve more quicker than anywhere in the world.
That's a good point. I want to go back to Macaulay. You mentioned that your organization and the organizations affiliated with the organizations that you work with are some of the leaders in e-payment. And some of the attractive features of e-payment is that there's a mode of transparency and accountability when you're dealing with e-payments. Is this a reason, and do you find, as you're working, that blockchain and finance through blockchain technology is becoming more attractive to the businesses and corporations that you come in contact with?
Okay, so thank you. Blockchain is new in our part of the world, I guess also out here, but it's a new technology that goes beyond financial services. I believe it helps with non-repudiation of transactions. Every transaction is spoken for, who initiated it, who benefited from it, and how the channel is gone through. Now, talking about my environment, our government hasn't taken a stand on the use of blockchain in financial services. I think the central bank has said, be careful. Not on blockchain though, but on the electronic cash that everybody, Bitcoin and everybody, if you want to call it that, they were running after, because we weren't sure the underlying value of Bitcoin as a nation. But from a blockchain point of view, there are exchanges coming up. There are a lot of...
What type of exchanges are you referring to?
Blockchain exchange. Blockchain exchange. Electronic exchanges, so that you can trade in blockchain currency, in electronic currency, and be able to do business, essentially. But I think there's a general direction towards adopting that. For instance, there are, in some of the clients I support, one of the states want to build a land management system, GIS, Global Information System for lands, Geographic Information System. And one of the companies that has come to bid is proposing a blockchain technology. And it's exciting to us because the land property is one thing that can help determine the level of economic activity in a society. So we would like to adopt that and make sure that anyone who owns a piece of land indeed cannot be disenfranchised by somebody else manipulating the technology. So yes, so blockchain and similar technologies are being embraced across. There's a continued digitization of our lifestyle. I think 2006, the federal government of Nigeria came up with something called E-Government Strategies Limited, Nigeria E-Government Strategies Limited, NEXT, which defined the automation of identity management, automation of tax systems, automation of every single thing that government does, government to government, and then government to citizens. The states are also adopting that. Businesses, I think, experience theirs, and then so there's significant progress in automation. Now, beyond using that as a way to create transparency is also used as a way to make money. So we have a large population of young people, millennials, as we call them. You don't need to be, you don't need any physical strength of extraordinary proportions to code a solution that can become a global solution, or to provide outsourcing support service to a company in Europe or America, as long as it has been automated. So there's a significant economic opportunity.
On how investors then see good governance and opportunity. What do you see as the media's role in dealing with anti-corruption and the perception that it projects here in the United States, which has a direct impact on the ability for these transactions to take place?
Yeah, I think the media plays a very crucial role in helping to change because of awareness. I think the world, and I go back to Africa when I look at the people of Africa, African people in general, no matter what country you're coming from. There's too many people suffering and because there are others who are benefiting for their own sake or whatever, and that's where corruption lies. So the media plays 2 points for me. One is awareness. The world is becoming more aware of what's going on, and then those other people can put pressure and contribute to how we can bring a resolution. Secondly, also are innovative, are not in the realm of corruption.
Is the Washington Times doing anything in particular that the African governments should take notice of as it kind of writes its stories and the...
Well, yes. One of the things that the Washington Times does do, we have done, which we do...
I asked that next week, National Security Advisor to the United States, John Bolton, will be announcing the Trump administration's new policy towards Africa. What is going to be the new engagement and the new engagement framework that the U.S. is embarked on as it relates to Africa?
To encourage support to establish such business hubs, innovation hubs, and business, industrial hubs, because that helps to truly activate the AGOA opportunity and turn it into a win-win. Because we're giving you better priced, because we have low-cost labor, and we have some of these raw materials home to us, so which we can channel and then help the economy here to also benefit. The last one is to expand what is included. ICT and outsourcing, because these take advantage of modern capabilities that are evolving and emerging from our society. So I think giving the AGOA, activating the AGOA opportunity is something that should be thought more of.
Thank you for those comments. Reverend Oliver.
Just in conclusion, I think I would, the advice that I would share with John Bolton is that America has a stronger presence in Africa with those entities that are causing conflicts, that are disallowing people to come in to invest, security, because that is preventing, one of the preventions of Africa, attracting those investors and also for its economic growth and development. So America to play a more major role, a more crucial role in bringing its maybe military strength or whatever to Africa in conjunction with different governments.
Is that to combat terrorism, sir?
Well, I would say, the first thing came to my mind, if you went into the Middle East and fought Al-Qaeda, Yeah, all of those guys. Yeah, also there's a igniting conflict, you know, because of the mineral, because of the potential there, and preventing others from coming, especially the American investors.
Panel for sharing their insights as it relates and pertains directly to Africa and anti-corruption. And I'm sure that we will be putting together a synopsis of your comments and reflections. Finance from Namibia, who is here with us this evening, and that will be shared through the African Leadership magazine right now. So this concludes our program for this evening, the formal portion of our program. I'd like to thank all of you for being here with us this evening, our honorees and recipients, my representative from Georgia that was here, and our business colleagues from Africa, as well as our clergy and media heads here in the United States. So thank you once again.
Award presentation because the Honorable Michelle had to leave. Award presentations before we go right into dinner, and also afterwards have our group photographs and all that. So very quickly, I would like to invite the our honorees. We have this evening we have actually 4 honorees that will be honoring with the African Leadership Awards. Let me just briefly, before we make this presentation, tell you a bit about African Leadership Magazine. Basically, what we do is that after sessions like this, we felt it was important that we commend those that are contributing towards the development of their countries, or as some of our business leaders who are helping to depopulate the unemployment market. Because in Africa, unemployment is a major issue. So anywhere we find members of the corporate sector who are helping to depopulate the unemployment market, we try to celebrate them and encourage them, because nobody gets to do that often. And most times we put together, bespoke gatherings like this to help us, showcase some of them and what they are doing, and also network, because we believe in partnerships, and this partnership can help sustain business growth in the continent. So very quickly, I'll invite Mr. Aaron Maniego. I'll invite the Honorable Minister to the podium, and he will help us hand out a couple of the awards. Then before we make his own is the final award presentation that we'll make. Honorable Minister, sir, if you don't mind.